Imagine standing on a narrow strip of land, waves crashing on one side, a sheer cliff on the other, and ahead of you, a wall of Persian soldiers so vast it darkens the horizon. You have 300 men. The enemy has hundreds of thousands, and you already know you are not going home. Thermopylae is remembered as the greatest military last stand in human history. A moment where flesh, bronze, and sheer willpower held back the destruction of an entire civilization. But here is the problem with legends. They only show you the final chapter, the blood-soaked climax. They never show you the darkness that created the man standing at the front of the line. Leonidas was not some noble warrior born with courage in his veins. He was not the composed, philosophical king Hollywood sold you. He was manufactured, forged inside a society so terrified of its own population that it turned child-rearing into a form of warfare. Sparta was nothing like Athens. There were no great debates, no marble academies, no poets sipping wine under olive trees. Sparta was a militarized fortress carved into the rocky hills of Laconia, where a small class of so-called equals ruled over a massive population of enslaved people known as the helots. These slaves outnumbered their masters by staggering margins, and every single day, the Spartans lived with one suffocating truth. If the helots ever united, Sparta would cease to exist overnight. So they built a system designed to produce killers, the Agoge. Boys were ripped from their families at 7 years old and thrown into over a decade of organized suffering. Starvation was policy, violence was curriculum, emotional attachment was a defect to be eliminated. No warmth, no softness, no individual thought, only the group, only the mission, only survival. And around 540 BC, a boy who had no expectation of ever becoming king was fed into that machine. A third-born son of royalty with no throne waiting for him. His name was Leonidas. What emerged on the other side was not a man built for peace. It was someone who had endured watching his own brothers spiral into ruin, who had survived years of calculated brutality, freezing nights with no shelter, days with no food, and the ever-present awareness that Sparta was a powder keg sitting on top of a lit fuse. So when Xerxes, the self-proclaimed king of kings, began assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen to avenge Persia's humiliation at Marathon, Leonidas was exactly the kind of weapon Sparta needed. And when a corrupted oracle delivered a prophecy that either Sparta itself would be reduced to ashes or a Spartan king must fall, Leonidas received that message the way he received everything in his life, as an order. No hesitation, no negotiation. Thermopylae was never an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life built on discipline, paranoia, and sacrifice. Before we step into that narrow pass and witness 300 men choose death over retreat, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from right now, your city and your country. And if you have not subscribed yet, take 1 second to do it. Help us keep uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Long before Persia ever cast its shadow westward, Sparta was already at war. But the enemy was not some distant kingdom across the sea. The enemy was underneath them. A tiny class of full citizens, the homoioi, sat on top of a massive population of helots, enslaved laborers bound to the soil of Laconia and Messenia. In some areas, these captive workers outnumbered their Spartan masters 10 to 1. Every meal the Spartans ate, every grain stored in their warehouses, came from helot hands. And every single morning, the The Spartans woke up knowing that if those same hands ever picked up weapons and rose together, the entire Spartan world would be gone before sunset. So Sparta chose fear as its primary tool of government. And nothing demonstrated that more clearly than the Plataea. On the surface, it was described as a kind of secret police. In practice, it was a death squad run by teenagers. Young Spartans, barely old enough to grow beards, were handed knives and minimal food, sent into the countryside, and given one job: hunt. But they were not hunting foreign soldiers. They were hunting helots. Any helot who looked too strong, too confident, too capable of leadership was a target. The Plataea killed at night, without warning, without trial. It was designed to keep an entire population too terrified to even think about resistance. And it doubled as training. Those boys learned to move silently, to kill without hesitation, and to carry the weight of blood before they ever stepped onto an actual battlefield. This was the world waiting for a boy named Leonidas, around 540 BC. He was not the son of some anonymous soldier. He was born into the Agiad dynasty, one of Sparta's two royal houses. Sparta had a system unlike any other Greek state. Two kings ruled simultaneously, each from a different bloodline designed to keep one another in check so that no single man could seize absolute power. In theory, it was a safeguard against tyranny. In reality, it was a machine that generated rivalry and suspicion. And in Sparta, royal blood did not mean luxury. It meant scrutiny. It meant expectation. It meant being watched every single day of your life. Leonidas's father, King Anaxandridas II, fathered several sons. The eldest was Cleomenes, the heir to the Agiad throne. Because Cleomenes was destined to become king, tradition shielded him from the full brutality of the Spartan training system. The reasoning was practical and ruthless at the same time. You do not risk shattering the boy who will one day lead your army. So Cleomenes was raised with a lighter hand, still Spartan, still hard by any normal standard, but spared from the worst of what the Agoge could do. Then came Dorieus, the second son. No such protection existed for him. He was thrown into the system with everyone else. He trained, bled, starved, froze, and endured every punishment designed to strip a boy down to nothing and rebuild him as a weapon. He came out the other side, fierce, proud, and filled with contempt for an older brother who had never earned what he was about to inherit. And then there was Leonidas, the third son, the one nobody planned for. Under normal circumstances, he would have spent his life as a soldier, maybe a commander, but never a king. And that status sealed everything. At the age of 7, exactly like every other boy whose family expected him to become a full Spartan citizen, he was taken from his home and delivered to the Agoge. His mother could not keep him. His royal name could not protect him. The city swallowed him whole. The Agoge was not a school. It was not a training camp in any modern sense. It was a years-long experiment in controlled suffering. Boys were divided into packs and housed in communal barracks. Each year, they received one cloak. That single piece of fabric was their only clothing through blistering summers and freezing winters. No shoes, no beds. They slept on mats they had to weave themselves from river reeds, and if they did not gather enough, they slept on bare ground in the cold. That was not a failure of the system. That was the system working exactly as intended. Food was deliberately kept scarce. The boys were given just enough to survive, but never enough to feel full. They were expected to steal the rest. Bread, cheese, scraps of meat, anything they could find. If they succeeded without being caught, they ate. If they were discovered, they were beaten savagely. Not because theft was considered wrong, because getting caught was considered weak. The lesson buried inside every empty stomach and every bruised rib was simple. You will learn to take what you need. You will learn to do it invisibly. And you will never, ever complain. Older boys held absolute authority over younger ones. That meant relentless bullying, physical assaults, and psychological domination dressed up as discipline. The whip was not a punishment reserved for serious offenses. It was part of daily life. Public flogging competitions were held at religious shrines, where boys were beaten until they collapsed or passed out, all while adults stood and watched approvingly. The entire point was to make pain irrelevant. Crying was shameful. Flinching was a disgrace. A Spartan was expected to absorb anything in total silence. And in the middle of all this stood Leonidas. Picture a boy who knows he carries royal blood but receives no special treatment whatsoever. No softer bed, no extra ration, no reprieve from the beatings. He is kicked awake before dawn, ordered to run, to fight, to wrestle, to obey without question. Many boys shattered under the pressure, some physically, some mentally. They became hollow, obedient shells, capable of following orders, but incapable of independent thought. The fragments that survive from ancient sources suggest Leonidas did not break that way. He adapted. Where other boys saw only cruelty, he saw a series of tests to be passed. Every scar, every bruise, every night spent shivering with an empty stomach became fuel rather than despair. He learned how to move without sound, how to fight as part of a unit, how to take orders without resentment, and eventually, how to command. And from all those years of silence and suffering, he developed one quality Sparta prized above almost everything else: laconism. Laconism was not just a habit of speaking briefly. It was a philosophy weaponized into conversation. Spartans trained themselves to use as few words as possible. Long explanations were weakness. Emotional outbursts were failure. Excuses were beneath contempt. A true Spartan opened his mouth only when his words could hit harder than a spear thrust. Leonidas absorbed this completely. He became the kind of man who could sit through an hour of debate and then demolish every argument with a single sentence. As Leonidas moved through the final stages of the Agoge and into full adulthood, the political landscape above him was shifting. His father aged. The question of succession stopped being abstract and became urgent. Around 520 BC, Anaxandridas died. Cleomenes, the eldest son, ascended to the throne as Cleomenes Thirster, and on that day, the fundamental crack in Sparta's system was exposed for everyone to see. The most powerful man in the state had never fully endured the one process that defined what it meant to be Spartan. Cleomenes was intelligent. He could be brilliant in diplomacy and devastating in war. But he was also erratic, impulsive, and increasingly unstable. Herodotus records episode after episode of a king who swung between genius and recklessness. He launched military operations without proper authorization. He meddled in the politics of other Greek cities, sometimes achieving remarkable results and sometimes leaving wreckage behind. Rumors circulated that he had bribed the oracle at Delphi to help remove the other Spartan king, Demaratus, from power. Whether that specific accusation was true or not, the pattern was unmistakable. Cleomenes believed rules existed for other people. Dorieus watched all of this with growing rage. He had bled through every stage of the Agoge. He had done everything the Spartan system demanded. In his own mind, he was the real Spartan, the one who had earned the right to lead. Yet he was forced to kneel before a brother he considered soft, privileged, and undeserving. That bitterness became unbearable. And so Dorieus chose the path Spartans despised most. He left. He gathered a band of loyal followers and sailed away to carve out his own kingdom. First, he attempted Libya. When that failed, he turned to Sicily, searching for a land where he could escape his brother's shadow and prove he was born to rule. But Sicily was already claimed. Carthaginian power extended across the island. Dorieus marched straight into the jaws of an established empire. According to Herodotus, he and nearly all his men were destroyed in battle against Carthaginian forces. The warrior who could not stomach living under a brother he despised died far from Sparta, chasing a throne that never existed. Leonidas stayed. He did not flee. He did not plot a coup. He watched, and he learned. He watched how a king could damage Sparta from the inside. He watched how pride and impatience had led Dorieus to a meaningless death on foreign soil. The third son, the one no one had planned for, was quietly absorbing lessons about power, patience, and survival that no stage of the Agoge could have taught him. During these years, he likely served in Spartan military operations, border patrols, and the ongoing suppression of Helot unrest. His life was not peaceful, but it was deliberate. He remained inside the system that had built him, waiting. Then Cleomenes spiraled beyond anyone's ability to ignore. His behavior became increasingly extreme. He drove away allies. His violence stopped serving any strategic purpose and became random, chaotic. The ephors, the 5 elected magistrates powerful enough to challenge even the kings, began to view him as a direct threat to Sparta's stability. Eventually, they made their decision. They declared him insane. For a Spartan king to be officially labeled mad by his own government was the end of everything. Cleomenes was seized, chained, and imprisoned. The man who had inherited the throne without ever facing the full weight of the Agoge now found himself stripped of all dignity, restrained like a dangerous animal in front of the people he once commanded. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing and contested moments in Spartan history. The official account says Cleomenes persuaded a guard to give him a blade. Then, alone in his cell, he methodically cut himself apart until he bled to death. It is a picture of absolute horror and total madness. But many historians believe the story was a carefully constructed cover. A king that unstable, that dangerous, that capable of dragging Sparta into catastrophe might not have been left alone with a sharp instrument by accident. It is entirely plausible that the same system that once elevated Cleomenes quietly decided to remove him. Whatever the real truth, the outcome was final. The first son was dead in disgrace. The second son was long dead on a Sicilian battlefield, and that left one man standing. Around 490 BC, Leonidas, the quiet survivor, the product of every brutal lesson Sparta had ever designed, became king. He did not win the throne through ambition. He did not seize it through conspiracy. He simply outlasted everyone ahead of him. And his timing could not have been more dangerous. That same year, the Persian king Darius the Firn launched an expedition to punish Athens and its allies for supporting a revolt in Ionia. The Persians landed at Marathon. The Athenians, reinforced by a small Plataean contingent, charged the Persian lines and somehow shattered them. It was a victory that should have been impossible. Instead, it became the most celebrated military triumph in Athenian history. For Athens, Marathon was proof that Persian power could be broken. For Persia, it was an unforgivable humiliation. Darius swore revenge, but death claimed him before he could assemble a second invasion. His son Xerxes inherited a throne that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean, along with his father's unfinished rage. For Xerxes, Marathon was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a personal insult to the empire itself. Over the following years, he began assembling something the ancient world had never witnessed, a military force of staggering scale aimed directly at the heart of Greece. While Xerxes stockpiled ships, conscripted soldiers from dozens of subject nations, and built bridges across entire seas, Leonidas governed Sparta in a manner completely unlike his predecessor. He was steady, measured. He followed the laws. He cooperated with the ephors instead of trying to outmaneuver them. His training had made him both cautious and decisive, a rare combination. Sparta did not need a gambler. It needed a king who would not lose his nerve when faced with impossible odds. And Leonidas was not operating alone. Spartan women received an education almost unheard of in the ancient Greek world. They were expected to be physically strong, intellectually sharp, and unafraid to speak their minds. Leonidas's wife, Gorgo, was legendary even during her own lifetime for her intelligence and perception. One story preserved by Herodotus demonstrates exactly how critical she was. A Spartan exile living in the Persian court, almost certainly the deposed king Demaratus, needed to warn Sparta that Xerxes was preparing a massive invasion, but sending such a message openly was suicide. If Persian agents intercepted it, Demaratus would be executed immediately. So he devised a method, writing tablet, scraped off all the wax, carved his warning directly into the wood underneath, then recoated the surface with fresh wax so that the tablet appeared completely blank. When the tablet arrived in Sparta, the officials who examined it were baffled. There was no visible message. They suspected a trick or a meaningless gesture. It was Gorgo who solved it. She told them to remove the wax. Beneath it, scratched into the wood, were the words that changed everything. "Xerxes is coming." That warning reached Leonidas because one woman refused to accept that something was empty just because it looked that way. As Xerxes' preparations grew too massive to conceal, he shifted from covert buildup to open intimidation. Persian ambassadors fanned out across the Greek world carrying a single demand: earth and water. These were the ancient symbols of total submission. Offering them meant surrendering sovereignty itself. Your land belongs to us. Your lives belong to us. You exist at the pleasure of the King of Kings. Many Greeks surrendered. Thessaly submitted. Cities across Boeotia bent the knee. Argos chose survival over resistance. Opposing the Persian Empire seemed like pure madness. Why sacrifice your city for an abstract idea like freedom when you could kneel and continue to breathe under the protection of the most powerful ruler on earth? When the ambassadors arrived in Sparta, they repeated the same demand: earth and water. On the surface, it was a straightforward choice: submit and live, or refuse and face annihilation. But Leonidas understood something deeper. There were customs even in war. Killing envoys was considered an act of barbarism that crossed a sacred line. Messengers were supposed to be untouchable, the last fragile thread connecting two sides before violence consumed everything. Sparta severed that thread with spectacular brutality. The story tells us that the Persian envoys were brought before the Spartan authorities and made their demand. The Spartans told them that if they wanted earth and water from Sparta, they were welcome to collect it themselves. Then they dragged the ambassadors to a deep well. "There," they said, "you will find all the earth and water you need at the bottom." And they threw them in. That was not simply a refusal. It was a deliberate, irreversible provocation. Sparta had not just rejected Xerxes. It had murdered his representatives in a way specifically designed to humiliate him. There was no diplomatic path left after that moment. War was now a certainty. The shockwave traveled across Greece. Everyone understood what Sparta had done. By killing those envoys, Sparta had guaranteed that Xerxes would come with everything he had. Fear spread like a disease. If the Persian army arrived at full strength and the Greek cities remained divided, every last one of them would be crushed individually. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and others gathered in desperate councils. They argued, accused each other of cowardice, and panicked. But underneath all the shouting was one unavoidable reality. Only one Greek state possessed a land army capable of standing toe-to-toe with Persian infantry on open ground: Sparta. Themistocles of Athens, one of the sharpest political and military minds in Greek history, proposed a strategy. Greece would not attempt to fight Persia across every front simultaneously. Instead, the Greeks would choose specific choke points and force the enormous Persian army into spaces where its overwhelming numbers became a disadvantage rather than an asset. At sea, the Greek fleet, built primarily around Athenian warships, would engage the Persian navy in narrow straits. On land, the massive Persian ground force would need to be held at a bottleneck so tight that only a fraction of its soldiers could fight at any given moment. Every map, every scout report, pointed to one location above all others: Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow coastal pass squeezed between steep mountain cliffs and the sea along the northern shore of central Greece. At its tightest points, the pass was barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand abreast. If disciplined, heavily armored Greek hoplites locked shields there, the Persian army would be forced to feed soldiers into the gap in small numbers, negating its greatest advantage. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Hold the pass long enough for the Greek fleet to win a decisive naval engagement. If the fleet succeeded, Persian supply lines across the Aegean would be severed. The enormous land army would then be stranded in hostile territory with no reliable way to feed or resupply itself. Leonidas understood the logic immediately. He also understood the risk. If Thermopylae fell too quickly, nothing would stop the Persian army from pouring into central Greece. Athens would burn. The Peloponnese would be exposed. He agreed to lead the land force north. To do that properly, he needed the full strength of Sparta's professional army. The real phalanx. The core that could hold any line. He went to the ephors and requested permission to mobilize, and he hit a wall harder than any Persian shield. The timing of the march coincided with the Carneia, one of Sparta's most sacred religious festivals, dedicated to Apollo. Spartan law strictly prohibited launching major military campaigns during the festival. The gods came first. Violating that rule was not merely illegal. It was considered an invitation for divine punishment. The same restriction had nearly prevented Sparta from sending help to Athens before Marathon years earlier. The ephors refused. The army would stay home. A force large enough to erase Greece from the world was assembling, and Sparta's own laws had frozen its military in place. On one side, religious duty. On the other, the survival of everything they had built. It was a contradiction that could have destroyed them. But Leonidas was a product of the Agoge. He did not waste energy fighting immovable obstacles. He looked for a way around them. The law prohibited the full army from marching. It said nothing about the king traveling with his personal bodyguard. Sparta maintained an elite royal guard of 300 hand-picked warriors, the finest soldiers in a state that produced nothing but soldiers. Leonidas went back to the ephors with a different proposal. He would not mobilize the army. He would simply take his 300 north as an advance force. Technically, it was not a campaign. It was a scouting mission, a preliminary deployment. The ephors, trapped by their own legal framework and terrified of appearing completely passive while Greece burned, approved the request. Perhaps they told themselves reinforcements would follow once the festival ended. Leonidas almost certainly knew they would not arrive in time. He added one final requirement that reveals exactly what he expected from this mission. Only men who already had living sons were eligible to join the 300. On the surface, it sounds like a cold administrative detail. Beneath the surface, it is devastating. Leonidas did not believe these men were coming home. He wanted to guarantee that every bloodline represented in that force would continue even after the men themselves were dead. This was not a heroic charge designed to win a surprising victory. It was a calculated sacrifice, planned from the very beginning. Spartan farewells carried no softness. Mothers and wives did not collapse in tears, begging their men to stay. Women in Sparta were raised to view cowardice as a fate worse than death itself. There is a famous instruction passed down through the generations, spoken when a woman placed a heavy bronze shield into a departing warrior's hands. With it, or on it, come back carrying your shield in victory, or be carried home dead upon it. If you dropped your shield to run faster, you had abandoned your honor and your place among your people. The last recorded exchange between Gorgo and Leonidas fits this culture with painful precision. She did not ask him why he had to go. She asked what she should do after he was gone. His answer was brief, practical, and stripped of all sentimentality. Marry a good man. Have good children. It was not a love letter. It was a final order. If he fell, Sparta still needed strong citizens. His personal feelings were irrelevant. The 300 assembled in their crimson cloaks, carrying their bronze-faced shields and long spears. Other Greek allied contingents joined them as they moved north. But before Leonidas marched to the place where he fully expected to die, he stopped at Delphi, the most revered religious sanctuary in all of Greece, to consult the oracle of Apollo. The Pythia, the priestess who spoke for the god, delivered a prophecy that confirmed what Leonidas already felt in his bones. Her words, recorded by Herodotus, left no room for hope. Either Sparta would be destroyed by the barbarian invaders, or one of its kings descended from Heracles would fall. The city could be saved only by the death of a king. No clever strategy could change it. No tactical brilliance would substitute. Blood for survival. A life for a civilization. For most men, that prophecy would have been a death sentence spoken out loud. For Leonidas, shaped by decades of obedience to forces larger than himself, it was almost clarifying. The uncertainty was gone. His death was not just a possibility, it was a requirement. Thermopylae stopped being a dangerous military assignment and became something closer to a ritual offering. He was walking toward the altar, and he knew it. He marched on. As the various Greek forces gathered near the pass, the gap between what had been promised and what actually arrived became painfully obvious. In theory, a large coalition army was supposed to assemble at Thermopylae. Spartans, other Peloponnesians, Phocians, Locrians, contingents from cities across Greece. In practice, fear and political hesitation crippled the response. Some cities sent token forces instead of their full armies. Others delayed endlessly. When Leonidas finally tallied his allies, he had roughly 7,000 men, including his 300 Spartans. It was nowhere near enough, but it was all he had. They reached Thermopylae. The terrain matched the strategy perfectly. Steep cliffs rising on one side, the sea pressing in on the other. At the narrowest sections, only a small number of men could advance shoulder to shoulder at any given time. The remnants of an old wall, originally constructed by local Phocians, still stood in partial ruin across the pass. Leonidas ordered it rebuilt and reinforced. That low stone barrier, backed by rows of armored hoplites standing in tight formation, would transform the narrow pass into a killing corridor. Scouts pushed forward and came back shaken to their core. What they had seen was not an army in any conventional sense. It was a migrating empire. Soldiers from every corner of Xerxes' domain, Medes, Persians, Egyptians, warriors drawn from the distant edges of Asia, cavalry units, massed ranks of archers, endless columns of infantry, supply trains stretching beyond the horizon, servants, engineers, administrators. The dust cloud they raised was so vast it blotted out the sky. Herodotus claimed the force numbered in the millions. Modern scholars estimate it was more likely somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. But standing on that road, staring into the approaching haze, the precise number was meaningless. It was simply more than anyone had ever seen. The Persian host finally materialized at the far end of the pass. When Xerxes himself arrived, seated in his royal pavilion, and surveyed the Greek position, what he saw must have baffled and infuriated him. The Spartans were not panicking. They were not scrambling to reinforce their wall. According to the accounts that survived, some of them were calmly grooming their long hair and stretching their muscles, preparing for combat with the same casual discipline they would bring to an athletic competition. Xerxes waited. Surely, once these Greeks fully grasped the scale of what was coming, they would break and scatter. They did not move. Days passed. Finally, he sent a messenger forward with an offer. Surrender your weapons. Submit. You will be allowed to live. It was a final chance at survival, delivered with the full weight of the largest military force ever assembled behind it. Leonidas, the man who had spent his entire life learning to say only what was necessary, delivered the response that would ring through every century that followed. 2 words in Greek: molon labe, come and take them. No further discussion, no negotiation, no retreat. The line had been drawn in the dust of Thermopylae. Before we continue, a quick word for you. If you are still here, if you have followed every step of this journey from a 7-year-old boy torn from his home to a king standing at the mouth of the hot gates, you are not a casual viewer. You are one of us. We have built something called the lineage. It is not just a support button. It is a way to stand inside this project alongside us. Members of the lineage are the reason these deep investigations exist. They make it possible for us to spend weeks building each story and verifying every source. They receive early access to new videos and become part of the inner circle that helps decide which buried chapters of history we open next. If that sounds like where you belong, if these stories feel like home to you, consider joining the lineage and claiming your place among us. Xerxes had his answer. He had stared across the narrow pass, measured the small force blocking his path, and extended an offer of mercy. Leonidas had thrown it back in his face. The King of Kings turned to his generals and issued the command. No more patience, no more diplomacy. Send the first wave forward. The mountain corridor was about to become a slaughterhouse, and 300 Spartans were standing directly in the center of it. The first troops Xerxes fed into the pass were expendable. Medes and Scythians, soldiers drawn from conquered provinces, shoved forward to test the Greek defenses. Their orders were blunt. March in, overwhelm the wall, sweep the defenders aside. With the sheer mass of the Persian army behind them, no one on the Persian side expected it to be difficult. They advanced in dense columns, officers driving them forward with whips, shields raised, voices roaring. Then they collided with the phalanx. The pass was suffocatingly narrow. The Spartans and their allies stood locked together, each man carrying a heavy round shield faced with bronze, a spear roughly 2.5 meters long, and a short iron sword on his hip. Bronze helmets encased their skulls. Bronze plates covered their chests and shins. They were not a loose crowd of fighters. They were a machine. And when the Medes crashed into them, it was like charging headfirst into a moving wall made of metal and muscle. The front rank of hoplites pressed their shields together into a seamless barrier. Behind them, the second and third ranks thrust their spears forward over the shoulders of the men ahead. From the Persian side, it looked like a single slab of wood and bronze sprouting a forest of razor-tipped points. Their lighter wicker shields and leather armor were worthless against it. The Greek spears punched into faces, throats, and chests before the attackers could get close enough to use their own shorter weapons. Leonidas was not commanding from the rear. He was in the front line, exactly where a Spartan king was expected to be. Crushed into the grinding press of bodies, drenched in sweat and blood, barking short commands, setting the tempo of the killing. When the Persians stalled, when the front rows of attackers began to buckle under the pressure, he gave the order every Spartan had been trained to execute since childhood. Push! Othismos! The rear ranks drove forward with every ounce of strength they had. The force traveled through armor and shields like a physical wave. The front rank dropped their shoulders and surged ahead. The Medes, caught between spear points stabbing from the front and the crushing weight rolling from behind, shattered. The men at the very front died where they stood. The men behind them stumbled over the corpses and were trampled. The soldiers further back could not even see what was happening. All they knew was that the line ahead of them had stopped moving. Officers screamed and beat them to keep them pressing forward. Step by step, they were herded into the same narrow corridor of death. The Persian dead accumulated so fast they became part of the terrain. The Greeks used it. When the front rank began to tire, Leonidas's men executed a maneuver they had rehearsed thousands of times. The line rotated. Fresh hoplites stepped forward into the killing position, while exhausted fighters slipped to the rear, all without opening a single gap in the wall. This constant cycling kept the Greek defense at full strength, while the attackers had no equivalent system. They were simply driven forward until they died or broke and ran. Wave after wave struck the wall. Wave after wave disintegrated. Xerxes watched from his elevated position, waiting for the moment the Greeks would finally crack, drop their shields, and flee. That moment never came. When the Medes failed, he sent in more troops from other subject nations. The result was identical. The pass was too narrow. Numbers meant nothing. All they accomplished was adding more bodies to the heap choking the ground. By the time darkness fell on the first day, the Persians had gained nothing. Hundreds, possibly thousands of their soldiers lay dead in and around the pass. Greek casualties were minimal. The defenders withdrew behind their wall as night settled, not in panic, but in disciplined order. They cleaned wounds. They repaired cracked shields and bent armor. They sharpened dulled spear points. The machine-like discipline that had been hammered into them since they were children was performing exactly as designed. Xerxes refused to accept that this was anything more than a temporary setback. On the second day, he stopped feeding second-rate units into the grinder. He sent his Immortals. The Immortals were the crown jewel of the Persian military, an elite infantry corps maintained at a permanent strength of 10,000 men. They earned their name because their number never decreased. The instant one soldier fell, another was immediately promoted to fill the gap. They were better equipped, better armored, and far better trained than the bulk of the empire's infantry. They carried a reputation for grinding through any resistance with relentless, methodical pressure. supported by devastating archery. They marched into the pass under their own standards, radiating confidence. They had broken enemies across 3 continents. No one had held against them for long. At Thermopylae, they hit the same immovable wall as everyone before them. The constricted terrain strangled their ability to deploy. Only the men at the very front could engage the Greeks. Their wicker shields and scale armor offered more protection than the cloth and leather the Medes had worn, but the Greek spears were still longer. The hoplite shields still interlocked into an unbroken barrier. Bronze still defeated wicker and leather. The Immortals pressed forward in disciplined ranks, and the spear points found the seams in their armor and opened them. Leonidas exploited the moment to shatter their morale completely. At a calculated point in the fighting, the Greeks executed a feigned retreat, stepping backward in perfect formation as though the line was finally collapsing. The Persians surged after them, convinced the defense had broken at last. Then, on a single shouted command, the hoplites reversed direction and charged, slamming their shields into the rushing attackers and driving spears through the tangled mass. The sudden reversal turned the narrow road into a butcher's floor. The Immortals, trapped between the carnage ahead and officers forcing them forward from behind, fell in piles. Herodotus records that Xerxes leaped from his seat 3 times that day in fury and disbelief as he watched his most feared soldiers fail to overwhelm a few thousand Greeks. Whether the detail is literally true or not, the image captures the reality. The King of Kings had committed his finest troops and watched them bleed out in a space too tight for their numbers or their archers to make any difference. By nightfall of the second day, nothing had changed. Persian losses were catastrophic. The Greeks were battered and exhausted, but the line remained intact. The narrow pass had transformed the largest army the world had ever seen into a procession of victims being fed one by one into a machine designed to kill them. Xerxes needed a way around the wall. From the front, the phalanx was doing precisely what generations of Spartan training had built it to do. No frontal assault, no matter how determined, could break through as long as the men behind those shields held their nerve. Then someone stepped forward, who broke the entire equation without ever raising a weapon against a single Spartan. His name was Ephialtes, a local man from the region of Males, not a warrior of any renown, not a figure of political importance, just a man who knew the mountains. He approached the Persian camp with a proposition. In exchange for a reward, whatever combination of gold, favor, or protection he hoped to receive, he would reveal a hidden trail that wound over the ridge behind the Greek position. It was an old mountain path known to shepherds and local travelers called the Anapeia path. This was exactly the fracture Xerxes had been searching for. If he could send a strong force along that trail and bring them crashing down behind the Greek line, Leonidas and his men would be caught between 2 armies. The phalanx, designed to face enemies from one direction, would be helpless against an attack from the rear. Shields pointing forward could not stop blades and arrows coming from behind. There was no hesitation. Xerxes selected a powerful strike force and placed it under the command of a trusted general named Hydarnes. Under the cover of darkness, Hydarnes led the Immortals and other elite units into the mountain. They moved as quietly as thousands of armored men could manage, picking their way through forest and rocky terrain, guided step by Ephialtes and other locals who knew the ground. Leonidas was not naive. He knew the side path existed. He had positioned a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain route specifically to guard it. Their mission was clear. If the Persians attempted to outflank the Greek position, the Phocians were to hold the high ground, block the trail, and prevent any force from descending behind the main army. But the Phocians were not Spartans. They had not survived the Agoge. They did not think the way Leonidas and his 300 thought. As Hydarnes and his column climbed through the night, the sound of boots crunching dry leaves and armor rattling against rock traveled ahead of them. The Phocians heard it. They woke to the noise of branches snapping and metal clinking somewhere in the darkness below. At first, they may have assumed it was a small raiding party. Then the scale of movement became clear. Not a handful of scouts. Thousands of soldiers were climbing toward them. Fear spread through the Phocian line like a fire. Instead of locking shields across the path and forcing the Persians to fight uphill into a wall of spears, exactly the kind of engagement that would have favored defenders on higher ground, the Phocians pulled back to a more elevated position, protecting themselves but abandoning the lower trail. Hydarnes had no interest in fighting them if he could avoid it. His objective was not to defeat the Phocians. His objective was to get behind Leonidas. He left a screening force to keep the Phocians pinned in place and drove the main column forward along the now unguarded path. The trap was closing around the hot gates. Just before dawn on the third day, the news reached the Greek camp at Thermopylae. A breathless runner arrived first, reporting that enemy forces had been spotted moving through the hills above them. Shortly after, a deserter from the Persian side or another scout confirmed the worst. The guard on the mountain path had failed. Persian troops were descending behind the Greek position. Within hours, the defenders at Thermopylae would have enemies pressing in from both directions. The Greek commanders converged on Leonidas immediately. The defensive plan that had held for 2 blood-soaked days was now falling apart. The options that remained were few, and none of them were good. They could abandon the pass and retreat south, but that meant opening the road. The entire Persian army would pour through into central Greece with nothing to slow it down. They could attempt to break forward through the main Persian line before Hydarnes arrived from behind. But the army in front of them was still enormous and rested while the defenders were running on fumes. Or they could stay and die where they stood. Leonidas called a council of the allied commanders. Representatives from the different Greek cities argued their cases. Some pushed for immediate withdrawal, insisting that saving the surviving soldiers for future battles made more strategic sense than dying in a pass that could no longer be held. Others argued that every man should stay and fight to the last breath, buying as much time as possible. Both positions had merit. Thermopylae was no longer a viable defensive position. It was becoming a cage. But Leonidas carried the weight of the Delphic prophecy in his mind. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king would die. If he retreated, he might save his own life and the lives of his men. But he would surrender the pass and shatter the symbolic stand that Thermopylae had already become across Greece. The Persian army would march through unopposed, and the story that spread from city to city would be simple and devastating. They ran. If he stayed, he would die. But every hour the Persians spent grinding down a final pocket of resistance in that narrow corridor was an hour the Greek fleet could use at sea, an hour Athens could use to evacuate its people, an hour the cities of the Peloponnese could use to fortify and prepare. His death would not just be a gesture, it would be a tactical purchase, buying time with blood. He made his decision. Leonidas ordered the majority of the allied forces to withdraw. The bulk of the Greek army would leave the pass immediately and fall back south. They were not cowards for going. They had a mission. Carry the warning. Rejoin the fight elsewhere. Keep Greece alive for the battles still to come. A rear guard would remain behind to hold the Persians as long as humanly possible. His 300 Spartans would form that rear guard. They were not the only ones who refused to leave. 700 soldiers from the small city of Thespiae chose to stay. The Thespians understood with perfect clarity that if the Persian flood rolled south unchecked, their city would be among the first to be swallowed. They volunteered to die beside the Spartans, fully conscious of what that decision meant. There were also roughly 400 Thebans. Their situation was different. Thebes had a deeply ambiguous relationship with Persia, and suspicion ran strong that the Theban government was already preparing to submit. Leonidas did not trust them. He held them at Thermopylae, not as honored allies but as hostages, insurance against the possibility that Theban soldiers might defect to the Persian side in the middle of the final stand. The rest of the Greek army began its march south, some left with heavy hearts, some left ashamed, some left with nothing but relief. Behind them, just over 1,000 men settled into position to face an empire. Before we follow them into that last morning, a quick pause. Everything you are hearing is built from real historical sources, ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and modern scholarship. The foundation of this episode comes from one book in particular, and it is not just interesting reading. It is a relentless, deeply detailed chronicle of ancient warfare, packed with debates and discoveries we can only scratch the surface of here. You can find it right now through the View Products button on your screen. If you want to truly understand Thermopylae, the Persian Wars, and the world that created Leonidas, this belongs on your shelf. Think of it as your personal war archive. And while you are there, you will find more than just one title. We have put together a collection for you, a curated vault of dark memorabilia and immersive pieces connected to this era, alongside our official channel library, essential dark history books you should own. We cannot list everything here because the collection evolves, but that is part of the experience. Open the shop tab while you keep listening, explore what is available, and start building your own library and artifact collection as you go deeper with us. Back in the pass, Leonidas turned to the men who had chosen to remain. The Spartans needed no speeches to understand what was happening. They had known since the day they were selected that this mission had no return. The Thespians had not been ordered to stay. They had chosen it freely. The Thebans knew they could not leave even if they wanted to. Leonidas had decided they would share the fate of the rear guard, whether they wished it or not. As the first light of the third day began to spread across the sky, the men still standing at Thermopylae prepared differently than they had on any previous morning. There was no plan to rotate fresh fighters into the line, no expectation of relief or reinforcement. They ate whatever food was left. They inspected their weapons one final time, tightened loose straps, adjusted helmets that had been dented by 2 days of combat. According to later accounts, Leonidas addressed his Spartans with a brief order before the fighting resumed. It was not about victory. It was about how to die. Somewhere in the hills above them, Hydarnes and the Immortals were completing their descent behind the Greek position. In front, the main Persian army was massing for a fresh assault, this time armed with the knowledge that the defenders were surrounded. 2 massive jaws of steel were closing on a tiny pocket of bronze trapped at the center. Leonidas and his men took their places in the line for the last time, facing forward toward the enemy they could see, knowing that another enemy was marching down the mountain behind them. The hot gates were about to become a grave, and every man still standing inside them understood exactly what that meant. The final day of Thermopylae had begun. At dawn on the third day, everything felt different inside the pass. The illusion of holding indefinitely was gone. Every man who remained understood that each breath was borrowed. The Spartans ate their final meal in full armor. No one pretended this was an ordinary morning on campaign. According to the traditions that survived, Leonidas walked the length of the line, meeting the eyes of every man still standing. He offered no false comfort, no promises. He gave them a single command that captured everything this day would be. Spartans, fill your stomachs now. Tonight, we dine in Hades. One final tactical decision remained. He could keep his dwindling force packed behind the rebuilt wall and let the Persians come to them. Or he could do the opposite, lead a charge beyond the narrows into the wider ground, and inflict as much devastation as possible before the encircling force arrived from behind. Waiting behind the wall meant being slowly crushed between two armies closing like the jaws of a vice. Attacking meant dying on their feet, moving forward, choosing who they would take with them. Leonidas chose to attack. He ordered the last defenders forward. The Spartans, the Thespians, and the Thebans, who had been held against their will, moved out from behind the protection of the wall and advanced into the broader section of the pass. It gave them room to strike. It also stripped away every safety net. There was no second defensive line to fall back to. No reserve wall. This was the last ground they would ever fight on. Xerxes already knew from his scouts and from Hydarnes' progress through the mountains that the Greeks were surrounded. He expected this final phase to be quick. His army reformed. Archers knocked arrows. Infantry pressed forward with the confidence that behind the Greek position, the Immortals were descending the slope to seal the trap. What Xerxes still failed to grasp, even at this late stage, was that Leonidas was not fighting to survive. He was fighting to make the cost of this victory so staggering that Persia would feel it long after the last Greek body hit the ground. The fighting on that third day was nothing like the controlled, mechanical defense of the previous two. The Greeks still formed ranks, but they did not hold a fixed position. They drove forward aggressively, smashing into the Persian lines again and again, targeting not just ordinary soldiers, but officers, standard-bearers, anyone whose death would ripple confusion through the enemy formation. Their spears drove through armor and flesh. When those spears finally splintered under the violence of repeated impact, they drew their short Xiphos swords and kept killing at close range. The Thespians fought with the same ferocity. Their city lay almost directly south of the pass. They understood with total clarity that if the Persians punched through unchecked, Thespiae would be among the first places consumed. There was no safe retreat waiting for them deep in the Peloponnese. Every second they purchased in this killing corridor was another heartbeat for their families to escape, for something to be saved from the wreckage. The battle dissolved into a series of savage surges. The Greeks charged forward, cut down everything in front of them, then were shoved backward by the sheer mass of bodies pouring against them. Each time they gave ground, they made the Persians pay for every step in blood. The road filled with broken shields, shattered armor, severed limbs, and heaped corpses. The air choked with dust and the metallic taste of blood. Leonidas remained in the front ranks. A Spartan king did not direct from safety. He fought where the killing was thickest. Ancient sources indicate he deliberately aimed his attacks at high-ranking Persians, trying to tear holes in the enemy's command structure and spread panic through their leadership. He had no hope of reaching Xerxes himself, who remained guarded far behind the lines, but he could still destroy the men closest to the throne. At some point during that rolling, savage fight, Leonidas fell. Herodotus does not give us a dramatic cinematic moment. There is no detailed surviving account of exactly how the blow came. Some later traditions claim he was brought down by a concentrated hail of missiles, spears, and arrows, finding him as his distinctive armor and position made him an obvious target. Others record simply that he died fighting with extraordinary courage. However it happened, the result was final. The king of Sparta, son of Anaxandridas, descended from Heracles, was killed in the front line, exactly where he had chosen to stand. What happened next reveals the depth of the bond his training and his leadership had forged. When Leonidas collapsed, the Spartans did not falter. They did not stagger backward in shock. They closed ranks directly over his body and turned the next phase of the battle into a war for the corpse of their king. Persian soldiers surged forward to seize the remains. For Xerxes, dragging that body back to the Persian lines would have been the ultimate symbol, proof that the stubborn Greek resistance was finally shattered. For the Spartans, allowing that to happen would have been a catastrophe beyond the military defeat itself. Losing their king's body to desecration would have been a wound deeper than any blade could inflict. The Spartans and their allies formed a tight defensive ring around the fallen king. Wave after wave of Persian troops threw themselves at the circle, trying to break through and drag the corpse away. Wave after wave was thrown back. Herodotus records that the Greeks repelled 4 separate full-scale assaults aimed at capturing Leonidas's body. During those desperate clashes around the corpse, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers were killed, cut down in the chaos of the melee. The Greeks managed to pull the body back toward their lines, but with every passing minute, more Persians flooded into the pass. Behind them, Hydarnes and his forces were completing their descent. Arrows began raining down with increasing density. The protective ring around Leonidas shrank steadily as more defenders fell and the dead piled higher inside the circle. Gradually, the surviving defenders pulled back to a small hillock near the rear of the pass, a low mound of earth that would become the site of their last stand. There, with Persians closing in from every direction, the remaining Greeks gathered whatever strength they still possessed. Their spears were gone, broken or lost in the fighting. Many shields had been smashed apart. Armor hung in shredded pieces. They still would not surrender. On that rise, they fought with whatever was left: short swords, daggers, stones pulled from the ground, bare fists, teeth. This was no longer the precision machine of the first day's phalanx. This was raw, animal survival driven by fury, by duty, and by the knowledge that every second of resistance still carried meaning beyond that hill. Xerxes watched. He had fed thousands of soldiers into that pass over 3 days. He had sacrificed elite units. He had watched his most feared warriors beaten back by a force that should have been annihilated in the first hour. Now, with his enemies packed together on a tiny mound and surrounded on every side, he chose the method that would cost him the fewest additional lives. He ordered the archers forward. They formed their ranks, drew, and released volley after volley into the cluster of Greek bodies on the hill. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, no remaining strength for a final charge. Arrow after arrow struck home. Herodotus records that earlier in the battle, a local man had warned the Greeks that the Persian archers were so numerous their volleys would block out the sun. A Spartan had reportedly answered that this was fine. They would simply fight in the shade. On that final hill, there was nothing left of that defiance but its echo. The sky filled with shafts, and when the volleys stopped, the mound was carpeted with the dead. The last Spartans died there. The Thespians, who had volunteered to stay, died beside them. Many of the Thebans died as well. Some Thebans may have thrown down their weapons and attempted to surrender. Herodotus suggests the Persians treated them differently, viewing them as unreliable enemies and probable future subjects rather than true rebels. Thermopylae belonged to Persia. The pass was open, and Xerxes had paid for it in carnage. Ancient sources cite figures as high as 20,000 Persian dead. Even if the number is inflated, the losses were devastating. For a narrow strip of coastal rock, and a delay of 3 days, the King of Kings had spent tens of thousands of lives. The victors walked the battlefield. They stripped armor and weapons from the fallen. They sorted Greek dead from their own. The Thebans who had survived were not rewarded for their compliance. They were branded, literally. The Persians burned royal symbols into their skin, marking them as property, owned men, a living testament that surrendering did not spare you from humiliation. Then Xerxes searched for one body in particular, Leonidas. They found him somewhere in the heaps of dead, his corpse torn and pierced like every other body on that field. At this moment, Xerxes faced a choice. In Greek warfare, even enemies traditionally respected the bodies of fallen commanders once the fighting ended. Returning a corpse for proper burial was considered a basic act of decency. There was a widely held belief that the dead belonged to the gods, and that mutilating a body invited divine punishment. Xerxes chose rage over custom. In a fury that had been building since the first day's humiliation, he ordered Leonidas's body decapitated. The severed head was mounted on a stake and raised for the entire army to see. The rest of the corpse was reportedly displayed or desecrated, a deliberate act designed to erase the dignity of the Spartan king and shatter Greek morale. If that was his goal, it achieved the exact opposite. The story that swept through Greece was not that Leonidas had died and been dishonored. The story was that Leonidas had fought until his last breath and terrified the King of Kings so deeply that Xerxes had to mutilate a dead man just to feel he had won. To Greek ears, that act revealed not Persian strength, but Persian fear. Not dominance, but insecurity. The soldiers who had left Thermopylae when Leonidas ordered the withdrawal carried the story south. They did not describe a simple military defeat. They described how a tiny force had faced the full weight of the Persian Empire, held it in place for 3 days, and died to purchase time for everything that came after. They told of the prophecy at Delphi, of a king who marched into a narrow pass, already knowing a god had decreed that either he or his city must fall. They spoke of the Thespians who chose to stay and die beside men who were not even their countrymen. They described how the Spartans fought over their king's body, killing Persian royalty in the process, and they mentioned with revulsion how Xerxes had severed the head and abused the remains. Thermopylae stopped being a lost battle. It became a story of deliberate, conscious sacrifice. From a strictly military perspective, Thermopylae did not stop the Persian invasion. After forcing the pass, Xerxes' army swept south. Boeotia fell. The road to Athens lay open, but those 3 days were not wasted. Leonidas had accomplished precisely what Themistocles' broader strategy required. He had delayed the Persian advance long enough for the Greek fleet to reach full readiness, for cities to stop debating and start committing, for populations to evacuate. Athens knew the storm was bearing down. Themistocles had already persuaded his city to pour its silver mine profits into building a fleet of warships, triremes, the fastest and most lethal vessels in the Mediterranean. Now those ships, reinforced by contingents from other Greek states, formed the backbone of the allied navy. While Xerxes advanced by land, Themistocles maneuvered at sea, luring the vastly larger Persian fleet into confined waters where its numerical superiority became a liability rather than an advantage, the exact same principle Leonidas had applied on land at Thermopylae. In late 480 BC, the decisive moment shifted from the hot gates to the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. There, squeezed into a channel between coastline and island, the Greek fleet used its knowledge of local currents, its heavier bronze rams, and its tight, disciplined formations to tear the Persian navy apart. Ship after ship was punctured, capsized, or driven onto shore. Persian crews drowned in waters where their overwhelming numbers should have guaranteed victory. Xerxes watched the disaster unfold, just as he had watched the catastrophe at Thermopylae. His supply lines were now critically exposed. An army numbering in the hundreds of thousands could not sustain itself off hostile land indefinitely. Without a functioning fleet to transport grain and reinforcements, his invasion was no longer a triumph in progress. It was a crisis. In a state of mounting alarm, he made his decision. He would withdraw the bulk of his forces back to Asia, leaving a powerful but reduced army under his general Mardonius to complete the conquest. He calculated that even a smaller Persian force, composed of veterans and supported by Greek collaborators, could eventually overwhelm the remaining resistance. After all, he still commanded soldiers drawn from across his empire, and he had willing traitors on the Greek side ready to open gates. The war did not end with his departure. In 479 BC, Mardonius attempted to force a decisive engagement near Plataea in Boeotia. This time, Sparta came with its full army. Under the command of Pausanias, acting as regent for Leonidas's young son Pleistarchus, the Spartan-led coalition stood alongside Athenian and allied contingents. The battle was chaotic, confused, marked by near disasters and moments where the Greek line almost disintegrated. But when it was over, the Greek hoplites had destroyed the Persian infantry. Mardonius himself was killed. The last significant Persian land force on Greek soil was broken. On roughly the same day, Greek forces at sea annihilated what remained of the Persian fleet near Cape Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor. Together, these twin victories ended Xerxes' dream of conquering Greece. The Persian Empire would remain a dominant force in the wider region for generations, but the ambition of absorbing Greece into its provinces died in those fields and on those waters. The thread connecting Thermopylae to Plataea is not a clean, straight line. There were countless decisions, betrayals, accidents, and acts of courage along the way. But without Leonidas's stand, the entire shape of that campaign would have been different. Without the delay in the north, and without the blazing example of defiance to rally around, many Greek cities might have chosen surrender. The fleet might not have been assembled in time at Salamis. The fragile alliance might have splintered under its own fear before it ever reached the battlefield. Leonidas was not a hero by modern standards. He was part of a system built on slavery, organized terror, and systematic cruelty. He grew up inside a culture that trained children to murder helots in the dark, that used starvation and flogging as educational methods, that treated any sign of vulnerability with absolute contempt. Even in his final stand, he made ruthless calculations. He handpicked 300 men not to win, but to die. He held the Thebans as hostages. He walked into the pass knowing a prophecy had already demanded his death, and he obeyed without a flicker of hesitation. He was, in every measurable way, the perfect product of the Agoge. And that is what makes Thermopylae so dark and so impossible to look away from. Sparta created something monstrous, a man stripped of softness, engineered to absorb pain, trained to follow the most brutal commands without question, willing to sacrifice everyone around him and himself for the survival of the state. And when the moment arrived that Greece needed something unbreakable standing between civilization and annihilation, that monster did exactly what it had been built to do. Sparta's instruction to its departing warriors was simple: with your shield or on it. Come home carrying your shield in victory, or be carried home dead upon it. Dropping your shield to run meant you had abandoned your place among your people. It was a fate considered worse than death itself. Leonidas fulfilled neither version. His body never returned to Sparta. Xerxes severed his head and desecrated the rest. But in a way no Spartan could have anticipated, he transcended that instruction entirely. He did not bring his shield home. He was not carried upon it. Instead, his story became the shield, not just for Sparta, but for the idea that a small, fractured, outnumbered people could stand against the most powerful empire on earth and refuse to disappear. Herodotus recorded the events of Thermopylae within living memory of the battle. Later generations of Greeks traveled to the site and erected monuments. One of the most famous inscriptions, placed near the mound where the last defenders fell, spoke directly to anyone who passed by. "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, faithful to their commands." That word, faithful, obedient. It slices through the romantic mythology that later centuries draped over the story. Leonidas and his 300 did not die as free individuals acting on personal conviction. They died following the laws and training of their city, shaped by a system that demanded total sacrifice and offered almost nothing resembling comfort in return. That same obedience nearly destroyed them as children. It also forged them into men who could look at the largest army their world had ever assembled and refuse to take a single step backward. Xerxes commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, perhaps hundreds of thousands depending on which source you trust. He had gold, warships, cavalry, siege engineers, and an empire spanning from the Indus to the Aegean. He held the title King of Kings. In every material, quantifiable sense, he possessed everything. Leonidas had a narrow pass, 7,000 men for 2 days, 1,000 for one more. A city that would not even send its full army because a religious festival took priority. A prophecy that promised his death. No realistic path to military victory. But he controlled the one thing Xerxes never truly understood: the story. By choosing to stand, by choosing to die in a place where allies and enemies alike would witness what happened, Leonidas transformed Thermopylae from a battle into a symbol. A line drawn across history. A warning. A promise. Centuries passed. Empires rose and crumbled to dust. The Persian Empire that Xerxes commanded vanished long ago. Yet people still know the name of a narrow, rocky pass on the Greek coast, and the king who chose to die there rather than step aside. In the end, that is the final balance sheet. Xerxes tried to erase his enemy's honor by mutilating a corpse. Instead, he carved Leonidas deeper into human memory than any monument ever could. Sparta is gone. Its rigid system collapsed under its own contradictions. Its fields are silent. But every time the story of a few standing against many is told, a shadow of that third morning at Thermopylae is there. You have walked this entire path with us, from the terror of the Helots, through the brutal childhood of the Agoge, into the madness of royal politics, and finally into the dust and blood of the hot gates. If you are still here at this final line, thank you. Now take 1 second, right now, and hit subscribe. Tap the like button so the algorithm pushes this story to more people who deserve to hear it. Share this video with someone who still believes legends are clean and heroic. Show them what it actually cost. This is Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world, and we will be here with the next story the moment you are ready to go.